Welcome to This Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're about to go on a seriously fascinating journey. We are going to completely deconstruct the mechanics of wealth, and we're going to do it by looking through two totally different lenses. First, we'll look from the bottom up, examining the intimate, everyday household budgeting habits of the self-made rich. And then we're going to dramatically zoom out and look at wealth from the top down. We'll dive into the staggering, inescapable macroeconomic statistical models that govern the entire system. It's this incredible friction between our individual daily choices and massive systemic math. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today, which will ensure we understand wealth from both the bottom up and the top down, without getting intellectual whiplash. We'll cover 1. The millionaire next door. 2. Accumulators and debt ratios. 3. The macro mechanics of wealth. 4. A temporarily unstable trajectory. And finally, 5. The math of capital taxes.
Section 1. The millionaire next door.
So to really understand wealth at the individual level, we have to look at the groundbreaking 20-year research of Thomas Stanley and William Danko. And I want to ask you directly, when you picture a millionaire in your head, what do you actually see? Is it a massive mansion, flashy luxury cars, a guy named Chad lounging on a mega yacht? Well, that is the ingrained cultural assumption, right? It's completely driven by mass media, but their data tells a completely different story.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the flashy, high-consumption lifestyle you see on TV is actually characteristic of what they call an under-accumulator of wealth. These are people who might pull in a really high income, but they literally spend it all just to look rich. The reality of the self-made millionaire, the prodigious accumulator, is honestly far less glamorous. They're highly frugal, they usually run a pretty dull but stable business, and they probably live right next door in an average town to people with just a fraction of their wealth.
The researchers actually identified 7 behavioral denominators shared by the truly wealthy. Let's fire through them quickly. They fiercely live well below their means. They deploy their time, energy, and money with incredible efficiency. They value true financial independence way over flashy social status. Notably, they had 0 parental economic support, and they actually passed that on by nurturing economically self-sufficient adult children of their own. Finally, they are super active in leveraging market opportunities and choosing the right, usually unglamorous, steady vocation.
Section 2. Accumulators and debt ratios.
So how do we actually measure if your individual microhabits are successfully building wealth? Well, it all comes down to your expected net worth. Here's the formula. You take your age, multiply it by your pre-tax annual household income, and divide by 10. So to put that into perspective, if you're 50 years old and earning $90,000 a year, your expected net worth is $450,000. Here's where it gets wild. Prodigious accumulators, those true millionaires next door we just talked about, have at least double this expected number, while underaccumulators have half or even less.
But what's the actual behavioral hurdle that separates those two groups? It is your debt-to-income ratio, or DTI. Lenders also call this FOR, or fixed obligation to income ratio. This is the exact share of your gross monthly income that just gets eaten up by servicing debt. Mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, the whole shebang. Keeping this metric strictly managed is the absolute bedrock of frugality. Because if your DTI gets out of control to fund a high-consumption lifestyle, the math basically guarantees you're going to become an underaccumulator no matter how high your income goes.
Section 3. The macro mechanics of wealth. Let's move to and see how this builds. Because if millionaires are just disciplined, frugal savers, why does the broader system look so incredibly skewed with wealth concentrating so aggressively at the very top? To figure this out, we have to zoom out and look at the work of economist Ricardo Fernholz. He developed this highly flexible, non-parametric statistical model analyzing wealth distribution. And by modeling 1 million households, Fernholz was able to perfectly replicate the massive, highly skewed reality of the U.S. wealth distribution.
So the crucial point is this. Fernholz proved mathematically that the entire massive macroeconomic distribution of wealth is driven entirely by just 2 statistical factors. Number 1, reversion rates, which basically measure the cross-sectional rate at which a household's wealth reverts to the mean. And number 2, idiosyncratic volatilities, which are the unique fluctuations in wealth experienced across differently ranked households. Regardless of how incredibly complex our economy is, these 2 rank-based factors capture all of it. They literally determine the shape of the entire wealth distribution.
Section 4. A temporarily unstable trajectory.
So what happens when we apply Fernholz's model to the actual empirical trajectory of the U.S. economy?
Using some incredibly detailed wealth data from economists Science and Zuckman, the researchers modeled a few different hypothetical future scenarios. We're looking at trajectories where the wealth share of the absolute top 0.01% continues to aggressively grow, while the bottom 90% declines. Like in Scenario 2, the top share grows by 1% a year. But pay real close attention to Scenario 4, where the top share grows by 3% a year, while the bottom 90% loses 1.5%. And remember, these represent real observed trajectories in our actual economy.
And this brilliantly illustrates the absolutely shocking conclusion of Scenario 4. Because if these growth rates continue indefinitely, the model predicts an extreme absolute divergence. The wealth distribution literally splits into two entirely separate populations. The top fraction of a percent eventually captures 100% of the total wealth, leaving absolutely 0% for the remaining 99.99% of households. It is a mathematical endpoint of extreme concentration.
Now, as Fernholz himself notes, the U.S. wealth distribution might be on a temporarily unstable trajectory. The absolutely critical word there is temporarily. A completely divergent trajectory where one tiny fraction captures literally everything, that cannot be sustained in the real world indefinitely. Something has to give. Some aspect of the macroeconomic environment, whether that's policy, institutions, or technology, will eventually have to shift to stabilize the system.
Section 5. The Math of Capital Taxes.
Let's focus purely on the mathematical levers within this statistical model that can actually alter that systemic trajectory we just looked at. In the model, we can test how specific inputs alter those reversion rates. One highly discussed input is a progressive capital tax, for instance, a 1 to 2% tax levied strictly on the wealthiest 1% of households. Now, without making any political or moral judgments about the policy whatsoever, we can just look at the math. In the statistical model, this tax mathematically reduces the growth rate of wealth for those specific taxed households by exactly 1 to 2%.
When you plug that single mathematical adjustment into the model, the results are deeply fascinating. Without the tax, the trajectory remains totally divergent and unstable, pointing straight toward extreme concentration. But with the tax applied purely as a statistical input, it alters the reversion rates just enough to completely reshape the entire distribution. The math shows that tweaking this single variable returns wealth inequality metrics right back to the stable levels we saw in the 1970s. Again, the model doesn't endorse the policy at all. It merely imparts exactly how incredibly sensitive the macro distribution is to the growth rates at the very, very top.
Which leaves us with a truly profound question to ponder as we wrap up. We've seen that on a micro level, wealth is accumulated through extreme personal frugality, avoiding debt, and immense discipline. But on a macro level, the concentration of massive wealth is dictated by sweeping statistical reversion rates and inescapable systemic math. So what do you think? Is wealth ultimately built by individual discipline, or is it dictated by systemic design? The friction between those two realities is exactly what makes the mechanics of wealth so endlessly fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this completely changed how you view the numbers in your own bank account and the numbers driving our whole economy.